Hey guys, this is Mikko from ML Sound Lab, and today I'll show you how I write the Djent. Okay, let's start with the disclaimers once again. I know there are tons of different kinds of djent bands out there, and I'm not claiming that this is the only way to make djent happen, or whatever this genre is called. This is the way I do it, and the kind of djent that I personally like is actually very simple. I'm not really into that million notes a second race car thing where we're all competing for who can play the fastest. I'm more interested in the math side of things, polyrhythmics and things like that, and I feel like if there's something really simple that kind of interests me enough so that I can notice myself banging my head, that's exactly what I want to do. So this is kind of a very simple polyrhythmic writing concept. If you agree with anything that I just said, I think you're gonna love this tutorial. If you didn't, then maybe have a look and see what I'm doing here. And if you completely disagree, please comment down below and bash me all you want, but I'll just show you how I do it, and hopefully that'll give you some insight to your writing, who knows. Okay, so starting off, we need some kind of a guitar that can djent, and what I have here is actually my 6-string baritone. So this is actually a 27-inch scale length guitar tuned down to G. It's got an Evertune and everything, so it's actually pretty djenty. And you know, that's just a 6-string. People tend to say that you need some kind of a multi-scale guitar, or you need 9 or 8 or 12 strings to get djenty tones. You can get a baritone 6 like what I have here and get the same kinds of tones. So that's just something to consider. It's more about the scale length than it is about the amount of strings. So let's get into it. How I would come up with a riff in the first place. This is kind of an embarrassing way, but this is how I do it. So if I want to get some kind of a riff, for example, if I want it to be really exciting, I start out with the feeling. And this is kind of a weird concept. I'm not sure if anyone else does this way. Most likely someone does as well. But I'm trying to kind of think of what the feeling is when I'm excited. So it's like, yeah, like that kind of a thing. And if you realize that your head is banging, that's actually a rhythm. And I know this is the stupidest thing I've probably ever filmed, but I use tap tempo to kind of get the tempo for that feeling. So when I have the riff and people hear that riff, maybe that feeling translates and that gets people excited as well. So that's the very first thing that I ever think about when writing a riff. So let's use tap tempo, and I'll use my excitement for the rhythm. So, man, this is so embarrassing. Let's do it. Okay, the tap tempo is saying 117. So that's what we're gonna be using here. The tempo will be 117. And like I said, I'm really into the math side of things and polyrhythmics, so usually that'll be the drums in 4/4 but the riff not. So let's start there. And what I'm using for drums is GTD Modern and Massive. Not because I think it's the best one they've ever made, it's just that I don't have the time to go through all the different archives and find new drum tones. I have something that I like and I'm gonna stick with it. So, okay, we have the tempo of 117. Okay, that's not 4/4, so let's jump back into the tempo track. You can see that I lied because I use different time signatures as well, but let's get back into it. Okay, so that's kind of the tempo that we'll be using here. And I actually always start with the polyrhythmic idea first. So let's just lay down some basic drums here. Not a flam. And then, man, This will be on a crash, for example. So if that's the basic concept that we have here, a 4/4 beat for the drums. Let's do 4 bars. And this is the most djenty thing you've ever heard. So that's the basic 1/3. Obviously, right now we could kind of try different kinds of snares as well, but I really want to get that polyrhythmic riff idea coming together. So let's jump into the math side of things. We have 4/4, which means that it's 8/8, which means that if we want to get some kind of a polyrhythmic time signature on top of that kind of contrasts, a good idea would be to have like a 7 or a 5, because those are not even with the number 8, so they will kind of, you know, do the polyrhythmic thing. You know what I'm talking about. So if we think about a 7, for example, in here, that would mean that we skip out the last beat. So whatever riff I come up with will be in between here and here. So this is now a 7/8. Already sounds like Dream Theater, but that's not what we're going for right now. What I want to get to is having a polyrhythmic idea. And I know the main thing that people usually start with is coming up with the first line. Personally, I'm more interested what happens on the second time around that it happens. So I'm actually gonna concentrate on the second time that this happens. So the second 7/8 will be here. Okay, and that sounds weird, and it's really a lot harder to make this part sound good. So this is what I usually concentrate on. So now I'm just trying to use the kick drum and make this sound good, this part of the riff. So I can already hear that the awkward part is that one crash coming on the second kind of 8th notes that we have here. So let's just try and put a kick in there. So something like this. I'm starting to hear a riff in my head. Something like that. Okay, is it all like this? Okay, I think that sounds pretty cool. So the trick here is the math geeky trick that I talked about. Now we have this 7/8 groove that sounds good on the second time around that it happens. So what I do is this simple. I remove the kicks, and actually I think that's also a part of the rhythm. So I'm gonna copy this. I'm just gonna polyrhythm it. And let's see what happens at the last rotation. It needs to start there. It needs to start there. Okay. So now we should have a polyrhythmic riff idea. And it didn't really take me that long to come up with this idea. Let's hope that it sounds good, because this is all random. So let's have a listen. That's pretty sick, right? I mean, did you see how simple it was for me to create this riff? That's really djenty. Ta-ha! It's not really that, difficult to build one of these things, but the interesting part is when you kind of have to figure it out in your head. When you hear that riff, you're definitely not thinking about the time signature that much. So when you hear that riff and you kind of notice that it's a polyrhythmic riff, and you start trying to figure out how it was done. So this is kind of like reverse engineering a polyrhythmic riff. Okay, so now the interesting part is, what kind of a riff do we build from this rhythm? So let's go back to where we had just that 7/8 thing. And once again, I'm always concentrating on the second time around it comes, because that's the difficult part to make it sound interesting. So it's like this part. So as you can see at this point, this sounds like complete poopy. So what I'm trying to do here is get some kind of interesting rhythm going on that I think will sound good as a polyrhythm. So many times when you have some emphasis on palm mutes and open notes, and those kind of interact with the polyrhythm, it'll be more interesting. So what I want to get going is something like a palm mute, open note, palm mute, open note, palm mute, and then the weird sound. So something like, but that's just going into this rhythm. Let me track that really quickly, and then I'll show you the end result. Okay, so while tracking that, I completely changed the idea to something else. So as you can see, I took 25 takes, just jamming on top of that 7/8 idea, and now what we have here is this. So very simple, and that's all it really needs. So let's take the same 7/8 beat and place it. Let's place it on the first here, and then just duplicate this. And this is all just sketching out the idea. Obviously, once I have the groove going and I've learned the riff in my head, that's where I'll retrack this once I kind of know how the riff goes. Right now, this is actually writing the riff using the Cubase project. So once again, I've never heard this riff before, neither have you, and this is the Djent riff that we just came up with. So that's essentially all there's to it. Obviously you can then kind of fine-tune the drums and fine-tune all the instrumentation and change the riff up and build from there. That's kind of how I get things started. Rather than me double tracking this and finishing it, let's try and come up with a different kind of riff. So let's not use a 7/8 polyrhythm for this. Let's do the same thing again, and let's do like a 5/8 kind of a polyrhythm. So I'm just gonna remove everything from the kick drums here, and just to change the vibe, let's go to a China symbol here. So And just to change the vibe again, let's not use a 1-3, let's use like a 2-4 drum beat. So this will be more upbeat, I suppose. Obviously you can switch around the snares for all these riffs and get more versatility out of them that way as well. So 5/8, that's what I promised. So once again, if you think about a 5/8, it will be, that's 4 and that's 5. So once again sounded like Dream Theater. So let's jump to the next beat and see what kind of awkward stuff starts happening there. For some reason I'm hearing this in a way where there's kind of a backbeat to the riff, like deep 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 boom. So deep 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 boom. Boom. Okay, that's just the first idea that I came up with. Came to my head, that's how I heard it. So once again, doing the same thing as before, just taking this rhythm, putting it all just for the kick. So that's 5/8, and then duplicating this pattern. Boom. Is that enough? I mean, we only have 1/4 left, so that could just be some kind of a fill type thing. Let's do that. That's what it's gonna be. So now we once again have this beat, and like I said before, I want it to be 2/4 type feel. So let's do it like this. And obviously the parts where there's kick and snare at the same time, remove the kick from there. So like this. Okay, this should be ready now. Let's have a listen to this new Djent polyrhythmic idea that I just came up with. Okay, I'm gonna switch this at the half mark to a 1/3 beat. So, let's do this. That should be there. So, okay, and that's it. Then let's go back to that 5/8 bits. We could have a listen to the riff first and see if there's like an awkward moment where we need to have the riff a specific way. So let's have a listen. I feel like maybe somewhere around here is the most awkward part. So if we just count to 5, we can kind of figure out where we need it to be. That's 5. That's 5. That's 5. Maybe concentrate on this part. And now we need to ignore this. And just like before, I'm just gonna jam on top of that feel and come up with some kind of riff that just fits that part, and we can put it on to the entire thing. So let's see how many takes it takes this time. Very simple once again, and if we place that 5/8 groove on top of this entire riff, what we should have is a polyrhythmic idea. And once again, it's not the final riff, this is kind of the starting point where you can start to build up an entire song if you feel like that. So my tracking was complete garbage, but you get the idea. You get kind of this polyrhythmic idea, and you maybe don't think about the first start of the riff because that's never gonna be the most important part anyways. So you kind of do this reverse engineering thing to get like a really cool polyrhythmic riff idea. Obviously, choosing the right notes for the riffing is a big part of everything. Usually I don't really talk about theory that much, so I'm gonna talk about Djent riffs in layman's terms and what kind of notes people usually go for. So obviously there's the 1-0, which is becoming some kind of a joke already. So but the thing with Djent is that it's all about breaking the rules, so it's not necessarily about using a scale. If you can in any way break a scale and make it sound good, that's most likely gonna be the best riff that you come up with. So what I see many people do is kind of lay a diminished scale on top. So what I mean with diminished is, so in layman's terms, that's like every note is 1.5 steps from the previous one, meaning first note is 0, 2 spaces, next note 2 spaces, 2 spaces, and that's the entire scale, and you're back to your root note. So and that's kind of the most evil sounding thing that you can come up with, most likely musically. Another thing that I see people using is pushing that forward a half step. So you have the root note, and the next note will be the 1. But the diminished scale starts from the first fret. So it's kind of a diminished scale with the root note being not a part of the scale, kind of a thing. So like this. And that's sort of a really layman's terms kind of way for you to kind of think about what kind of notes you want to use, and those are the more evil sounding notes to use. Obviously the most used and overused scale of all music of all time in rock music and Djents and stuff like that is definitely gonna be the minor scale, which is essentially the pentatonic. So it will be very simple and basic sounding, but obviously what's most important when you're making this is not to think about scales, but if you do want to use scales to kind of support your theory and your kind of composing, what I would like to challenge you to do is try and break the scales and come up with your own kind of scale that's using kind of parts of these scales so it makes sense. For example, if you pick 5 chromatic notes, that would mean, which would definitely not be anything besides a chromatic scale. You can also think of that as being the minor scale and the half pushed diminished scale on top of each other. So if you kind of think about the riff as being 2 different scales, then that will kind of give you an idea when to use a specific note, and that will most likely make a riff that's essentially a chromatic scale make more sense. For example, if I go back and forth between the minor scale and the diminished half step pushed forward type scale, it would sound something like this. And suddenly it doesn't sound like you don't know what you're doing. You're just going back and forth between those 2 scales, although yes, you are using essentially a chromatic scale, all the notes, but because you know what you're doing when you're using them, it doesn't sound that bad. So these are kind of the kind of things that I usually think about when I'm making these kinds of riffs, where I try and break the scales as much as I possibly can. Obviously, with djent music, it's always cool to have some kind of a weird sound that you don't really understand what's happening there, and that's also a big part of the riffs. So if I can, I'll add in some kind of weird sound like, or if you get some kind of a unique tone out and you can make it work in a riff context, that's many times the coolest thing. And obviously with djent you have a lot of muting, so the djent muting essentially would be to, you know, mute 4 strings and then I see a lot of scratching like you know, random stuff like that. So it's all about coming up with something fun and unique sounding. There are no rules, but if you need assistance on where to start, maybe this tutorial helps you out a little bit. I had a lot of fun doing this, and this is actually a response to some of the more frequently asked questions, like how do you start writing a riff like this? And I know I have a system, so I wanted to show you guys. Okay, thank you guys for watching the video, and see you guys later, and you know, subscribe and stuff like that. See you guys later. Bye.